Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Senior Manager for Content Production at UserTesting, and joining us today as host is UserTesting CEO, Andy McMillan. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, everyone.
And our guest today is Judd Antin. Judd is an executive coach, consultant, advisor, writer, and teacher. He has led design and research teams at Yahoo, Meta, and Airbnb. His direct reports have all gone on to lead user research at Figma, Notion, Slack, Robinhood, Duolingo, AllTrails, and more. Today's topic is the UX reckoning 1 year later. The Cliff Notes background on this is that about a year ago, Judd published an article titled, "The UX Research Reckoning is Here." In it, Judd argues that UX research discipline must undergo a significant transformation, moving away from predominantly middle-range research to a more balanced approach that emphasizes both micro and macro research. This shift is necessary, he contends, to align more closely with business needs and demonstrate clearer value in driving strategic decisions and detailed user interactions. Welcome to the show, Judd.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here. Appreciate being on Insights Unlocked.
Judd, welcome to the show. As Nathan said, it's been about a year since you published your article. I know I read it not long after it was published. It certainly made the rounds here at UserTesting and through a lot of our customers. I thought it was excellent in both it being sort of well-reasoned and thoughtful. I thought you did a great job of sort of taking a step back and sort of looking critically, I guess, in our industry and what we all do. And so I just wanted to kind of dive in and talk about it a little bit more. I know there was a lot of activity around it and people talking about it. I thought it was interesting in the comments. There were some people that loved it, some people that didn't, but a lot of people who sort of identified with it even if they didn't love it. I always think that's a really well-written and thoughtful piece. If people who don't necessarily want to agree with you can read something and say, I don't know if I was excited or concerned or whatever, but it's really made me think. And I think that's important when an industry goes through change. And so I thought this would be a chance to just sort of talk through it a little bit, but maybe since it's been about a year, let's start off the bat here. Do you think anything has maybe changed since you wrote the article?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things have changed. Like one thing that's changed for me is I'm trying to stop using the word reckoning entirely. Like now I say our word. Because now people say the word reckoning and kind of roll their eyes, and I do too. I'm like, and I don't want to be the reckoning guy. I also think that word is maybe a little bit more negative and doomsaying than I really intended. But thinking about what's changed, some things haven't. I think it continues to be kind of a tough time. Being honest, I thought it'd be getting better by now. I think the uncertainty around macroeconomic conditions. And then I also think, there are a lot of companies out there plowing every last dollar they have into NVIDIA chips and AI servers. And I honestly think that is a meaningful depression on a lot of other types of spending and hiring right now. But aside from that, I'd say, the reason I wrote that article is because it was something I was thinking about and I wanted to inspire conversations in the discipline. So exactly as you said, Andy, I was like super pleased, like that people liked it, people didn't, many people disagreed, many people agreed. That was kind of the point. I think there has been a broad consensus over the last year that there is some evolution happening. Maybe there's like productive disagreement about what it is. Great. I think there was coming out of that article, there was a large kind of anti-capitalist contingent who were not comfortable with the idea that researchers needed to be more in service of profit. That continues to confuse me a little bit, but I kind of understand.
That's a hard one. It's a hard one. I mean, if you want to work in the private sector, and I think there's a lot of benefits to doing so, the profit mode is a tough one to get away from. I mean, it is ultimately at the end of the day what makes a business successful.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people turn it into a binary, like either you are fully user empathy focused or, like at the most extractive, terrible form of capitalism where you're just like sitting at the table with the devil waiting to poke your eyeballs out. It's just not, that dichotomy is false, right? We can be in service of profit, making our businesses better at the same time as we are practicing our craft as people who are user focused. So I think there's a lot of momentum now. One good thing that's changed in the last year is there's now, I wasn't the first remotely to be talking about, in that article, to be talking about how important it is for researchers to be more business focused on business value. But now I would say that conversation is happening everywhere at every level in every way. And I think that's a big step forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are always exceptions to the rule. So I'm sure you and I could sit here and come up with examples of places where what's good for the user isn't necessarily good for the company or vice versa that is providing a product. But I think by and large, most companies are pretty aligned on trying to make their customers happy and successful. And I think one of the mindsets I've seen researchers bring to the table is that most companies have some sort of slogan, right? Customers first, customers always right. We care about our customers, whatever it is. And yet sometimes we use those products and we think, how can that be the case? This product is terrible. And the thesis I've had for a long time is I think it's just that people aren't able to walk a mile in their customer's shoes to have that empathy. And I think that is where researchers can play a role. I liked in the article, you talked a lot about how to play a role that was not just what you called sort of this middle zone, right? This sort of idea that you're there sort of validating a feature set, but rather sort of micro and macro. And that should be, I think in the article you said sort of 90% of the effort should be in these sort of micro and macro areas. Could you share with the audience a little bit, what do you mean by micro and macro, and sort of why are those the areas where UX researchers can demonstrate this sort of, I would say both business value, but also I think the article does a nice job calling out that sort of also is the area where maybe the calling that brought people to user research can also be best met. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
For sure. I definitely still believe that the balance of research that we do is way off in terms of the ratio of those three things. I think, for example, that micro research, which I would define as kind of like the more tactical, closer to the ground work we do in service of the product and design development process, evaluative testing, user sessions, usability, eye tracking, all that beautiful stuff. One thing about that is that I think, I don't know, I think a lot of researchers think it's beneath them or it's not sufficiently a good use of their skills. And I think, okay, but I've also seen it be the most direct line to demonstrating business impact. Like researchers often talk about metrics for impact. And I think, when you are at that level where you are making designs better, identifying bugs, conversion bottlenecks, confusion in the product, there's no better place to be able to directly point to the way that your work impacted the bottom line. So number one, I really think we should be doing more of that work. I also think that macro research is the path to researchers having more engaged partnerships with executives, which is a huge problem that we've had in the discipline. I would say not sufficient focus on our role, not just as influencers, but as decision makers, like in decision-making seats. And when you focus on the larger, what I called macro research, which is really just saying like, hey, doing research which has a longer time horizon, it's aligned to decisions the company need to make about its strategic focus over the 12, 18, 24-month horizon. Like you get in that decision-making seat. You can, I remember having a conversation recently with the CEO at a company where they were saying like, oh, UX is one of our differentiators. And I, being a consultant, in a privileged position where I can be like, really? I don't actually think it's that good. And hopefully I did that in a nice way. But then he said, well, look, I don't want to guess at that. I want to know whether putting the resources into meaningfully improving the user experience, our design system, things like that, is the right prioritization versus the many other things we might do. Do you know anybody who could help inform that prioritization question? Because I do. Companies should change their strategy. Companies who change their strategy all the time, which is a syndrome I think a lot of companies have, is that they pivot strategies every 6 months. Well, that's not a strategy. Strategies tend to be durable. You have to work at it for a long time, and they shouldn't change. They should change on the order of 18 months or so is what I generally think. And when that happens, when they change too often, it's usually because they didn't have the insight baked into it to begin with. So researchers can drive a huge amount of relationship and business value by focusing that macro zone too.
I love that. And I think part of that strategy of the month or strategy of the quarter problem is not having a long enough horizon in your planning. And so to your point, if you can bring in researchers and folks that have the ability to look out past that immediate horizon, look, it's not easy being in the boardroom. You're trying to make quarters and all those things. And so I think it does sometimes drive that short-term thinking. But the best companies, I agree, are the ones who can set an 18 to 24 month strategy, but they've got to be able to sort of look out to that horizon. Is a short aside, we had one of my leadership offsites recently, and we actually brought in our head of product strategy who has a UX research background. and he walked through an 18 to 24 month strategy with my leadership team. And it was excellent because he was really able to bring sort of a research construct to how to think about these problems, how to frame things up. And I think that's a skill set that researchers have that maybe doesn't get used in that way nearly often enough. And everybody in that room thought it was hugely valuable. So, I mean, it's definitely a way to your point, sort of demonstrate business value. And if I can make one other quick point, I think on your first item, one of the things I think with micro research we're seeing is this emergence of researchers thinking about how to scale small impact, right? So while you might think of micro research as being one little decision, but what if you could set the team up to score and analyze at scale what you're doing, and then you can dive into those problems. And I think that's also a really interesting way to think about lots of small things adding up to having big impact. And so I like that model a lot.
I really agree with that. I also think I have never, I think ever, seen a usability study that did not also yield useful aggregated insights that are at a mid or high level. It's not like you get so much out of doing usability. You're still with users and customers. If you're paying attention and you're doing the smart analysis, you kind of get your cake and you can eat it too. And I love that you made that point, Andy, about your product strategy, because researchers should be good at frameworks. We are good at frameworks. And yet somehow we don't end up in this position where we're providing the scaffold for strategic decision-making and focus, right? I think we can be better at explicitly driving prioritization. And I think to do that well, we kind of have to get off our high horse about users. Because yes, users, yes, empathy, but also viability, feasibility, profit, all the other things that a business has to worry about. And we actually earn a huge amount of credibility when we can say, like, look, this is what we heard. These are the insights that we've got. Here's a framework. And that framework is not so laser focused on users that we've forgotten it's actually about matchmaking. It's about figuring out the intersection of what users want and what the business needs.
I agree with that, Judd. I think the best researchers I work with end up building an incredible amount of intuition about the needs of the customer that are not met. And that's often the next business opportunity, right? It's not just what the user's telling you, but it's also what you're learning about them over time. And it's a real source of knowledge in the organization. And I think if that knowledge doesn't get extracted up into that sort of macro thinking, I think that's a miss. And it's a thing that I think most researchers are actually quite good at when given the opportunity and the space to sort of articulate it. So I want to maybe shift to another piece that you put together that I thought was great as well, which was you wrote a piece called A Bright Future for UX Research. So sort of, spinning that R word you said earlier, the reckoning, a little bit towards a bright future. And you're quite optimistic in the piece about the evolution of UX research. And you talk a little bit about the rise of AI and automation, but ultimately you get back to this idea of human-centered research and how that evolves. So could you maybe share a little bit about the skills behind that? You talk about the skills that researchers should have to stay relevant, to use these technologies to sort of drive business value. So could you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, for sure. AI is sort of dominating the conversation a lot of times among researchers, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. My own opinion is a bit more measured than a lot of my colleagues. Like, I think the marketing for AI services is 3 to 5 years ahead of what the technology can actually do. And so one example is I've looked at and talked to a bunch of companies that produce products that, let's say, do AI interviews. They say what they want to say is you don't need a researcher anymore. This is why researchers are worried. They're like, AI is going to take our jobs. And they say, you don't need a researcher anymore because we got AI that can do research or interviews. And I look at their products and I think, and I've said this to several of them too, which is like, I think this is way less like replacing a researcher and way more like better than a survey open end.
Yeah.
It's like much better than an AI, than a survey open end. But AI can't replace a researcher. I think it can make us way more efficient. The way it might impact our jobs is like a researcher with those tools at their disposal can now do the work of 3 or 4, because we have the always on assistant. So definitely becoming proficient with the latest generation of AI tools, the way that they can scale research practice is important. I think it's the same conversation that we've been having about democratization. Should we, shouldn't we? Which I think is silly because you can complain all you want, but the genie's not going back in the bottle. Like, we have these tools at our disposal now. They will never not be at our disposal. So to stay relevant, we stay abreast of the tools, learn their pros and cons, use them to drive efficiency and scale and scope. But I always think about my first boss and at Airbnb was the chief design officer, Alex Schleifer. And I don't know if he ever put it this way, but he had this 90-10 rule. And when we were talking about everything UX, and he said basically design systems should be like 90% of how a product is designed, and creative innovation the other 10%. If we're building a global product, which we had to do at Airbnb, we had to serve 191 countries around the world. The global product, the part that doesn't change, has to be 90%. You cannot build that more than that. And the localized product is like the other 10%. But that 10% in either of those cases, it's like the tires on the car. The rest of the car doesn't matter without them.
Right.
And so the researcher is the tires. Like that's the point of this analogy here. Like, and I think last thought I have on this topic, and it actually goes back to something you said earlier, Andy, is that I would argue there's a big shift, especially for researchers and researchers leaders, where we have to think of ourselves as the product, right? It is not just the value of the research and insights that we are delivering. It's you, right? Like we think about a lot of good researchers are like, well, I need to differentiate between my opinions and the data I bring. Fair enough. But fundamentally, I don't agree because of what you said, Andy, because the best researchers speak from evidence, but through the lens of their perspective, they are valuable precisely because they provide an intuitive reasoning on top of that data and on top of that insight, which no AI will ever replace. So actually, we make ourselves easier to replace the more we just see ourselves as kind of purveyors of insight and not actually the source of the product ourselves.
I think that's a very thoughtful and well-structured mindset for that. The approach we've been seeing where there's the most success is this idea of if I can scale as a researcher, because again, I think we went through this period maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and this is where democratization came about. It felt like we reached a tipping point where a bunch of people went, you're right, I do want this kind of research. And they turned around and said, I'll take 10x more of it. And we went, well, I can't do all of that. So now I've created this problem. And so then we said, well, now you can't have it. And then people are like, well, I'm going to have to go do this myself. And I think the equilibrium there is, well, can I set up a system where I trust that by and large, there's good signal being collected, that I have visibility into that signal. But then to your point, I want to bring my intuition and my knowledge and my skill set and my way to interpret and solve problems. That if I instrument the whole, let's say, design process or product build process, I want to be able to see as a researcher, there's a problem over here. We're identifying an issue, something I want to dig in. I want to learn about it. I want to go deeper. And then I want to come in with recommendations and insights. I think that's very valuable to a business. And I think actually really interesting to researchers. Like that's a great job. And you're right. That's not something that's going to get replaced by AI.
Never. Yeah, no, I totally agree. At Airbnb, I used to say our organizing principle is relationships. So it's not the product. It's not the parts of the product. It's not insights. It's relationships. It's like, who are your key people, right? Who are the people you need to be next to and developing that strong relationship with? Because that is the most value you can bring. We'll know when we're successful when they cannot have that decision-making meeting unless you're in the room, because no AI will replace that. Like it will help you be better in your job and scale more, but fundamentally they need you there. So us as researchers, and especially when no, actually that's not true. At every level, from intern to head of research, I think, who are your people and how do you make yourself indispensable to them? I think we do ourselves a disservice by thinking of our job as both delivering insights, but also primarily influencing. Yes, we are not generally writing the code. We are not generally designing the pixels. Sometimes we are. But we should think of ourselves as decision makers, not just people pitching insights over the transom, hoping they influence a person. So that happens in relationships. And like you said, an AI will never, OpenAI's announcement yesterday aside, like I don't think researchers are in any danger anytime soon of being replaced by a bot.
And when you talk about building stronger relationships, which ones would you focus on? I mean, you have some great examples here of how you've partnered in these organizations. Like, where do you focus? Like, if you landed in a new company tomorrow, a large organization, you're running the research team, like, who's your first call? Who are you reaching out to?
You start with your boss. You always start with your boss, right? Like, and I think that, certainly you want to get to know them. You want to know what they're working on, right? Personally, what are they invested in? What's keeping them up at night? What are the itches you can help them scratch? Like that's the first thing, right? When you start making things easier for your boss, that is the shortest path to influence and authority, right? And then I think, sometimes with my coaching clients, especially, and most of the work I do is with executives, but it's the same thing in every function, at every level, which is an allies or adversaries activity, right? So top two, no more than two. Like we get three total. Like you can't do more than that. So like your list of top three, maybe it has one or two allies and one or two adversaries. So that's the second place I'd start. Like people who can be particularly helpful for you as allies in some regard. And then like when you become professionally good at turning your adversaries into allies, like you're winning at life. Like that's you having impact. And, at Airbnb, I had the chance, I joined as head of research, but at different points, I was head of design for guest products. I was the interim GM of a product group, and I left as the head of the design studio. Those things happened not primarily because of any insights that I generated. They happened because of my ability to take a researcher's mindset to those relationships and the social situations which create them. And then often it was turning adversaries into allies. It's a big thing. Thinking of researchers thinking, take those research skills that you usually apply to users and instead look inward at your colleagues. Think of your social situation of work as just as worthy, perhaps in some situations more so, of that attention, because it'll help you be more in that decision-making seat with stronger relationships.
That is a great concept. And I think the adversary one is a particularly interesting one, I think, because my experience with a lot of folks in the research field is I would not say it is a very high conflict or conflict seeking group generally. But I think having the mindset of where there is an adversary or somebody who has a negative point of view on the value of what you're doing, I think honestly engaging with that, you don't have to be high conflict about it, but I think engaging in that thoughtfully and trying to change minds is really important. And I think that's something that we could do a lot more of in our space. And maybe here we sort of touched on, at the start of the show, we talked about your sort of rich background leading teams and shaping leaders at really great companies. Maybe a good ending point, because it's been a fascinating conversation, but maybe I want to make sure we touch on some of your personal perspectives here too. What lessons have you learned about leadership, specifically in the context of UX research and research generally, and how to sort of foster that culture of innovation would you share with our audience?
Yeah. We've talked about some of them already. Like I think researchers in particular are too navel-gazy. They think that the more senior they get as a researcher or a research leader, that just means the more central or large the research problem you tackle. But actually, I think a lot of times the more senior you get as a leader in any discipline, the less of your work has to do with your technical expertise.
Right.
It's the floor. Like you do need to have technical expertise, but that's the floor. Everything around that is the people around you and the social dynamics of work. And so that, like we were just talking about this with researchers spending more time sort of thinking of their colleagues. I teach a graduate class in leadership at UC Berkeley, which has this as a thesis. The thesis is leadership is a research project. It's like we go week by week through all of this, good sort of science like research, but also practical case studies and things like that go from one to another to show actually what differentiates a great leader is when they're able to be good students of the people around them and the social situations around them, and then put that to use. And one concrete example, one of my favorites, is there's this book from 1989 called Influence Without Authority by Cohen and Bradford. And it's like so famous in the management discipline. It's called the Cohen-Bradford model. And it's about the idea that people have different currencies. And by currency, they just mean like things they care about. And that the way to be influential is to find out what other people care about and then match it to what you care about, not the other way around. Like, easier said than done. But like to do that, like a researcher should be really good at that. You know what I mean? Like to be a leader, to be, and I think not enough researchers are interested in flexing their muscles that way. They're too stuck in being a researcher. Like I say, don't think of yourself as a researcher, but also you're just a product person. Now you're a leader who needs to build strong relationships. You need to solve problems for the business. Like I found myself in a whole variety of different situations that had nothing to do with research. building processes and structures, jumping into dumpster fires at different companies. But not because, I mean, I think it helps that I have a research background, but the thing that if I was successful in those situations, it was not primarily because of being a researcher. It was because I was applying that research perspective to the task of leadership, which had honestly nothing to do with user insights. And I think more researchers should take that to heart in their everyday. And the reality is that takes some time away from doing primary research, but it's time well spent because the work you do will be higher impact.
I think that's great advice. I have the experience since coming to user testing of just loving meeting with our customers. I've worked in lots of different areas. I've worked at companies that sold to salespeople and marketers and IT professionals, and I find the researchers that I talk to have such incredible insights. They're very thoughtful about their approach. They're very good, to your point earlier, about frameworks and how to put problems together. I think that's such a valuable skill. Again, well beyond the research, like it's sort of grounded in that background, but well beyond it. And I really like your framing on the model as well. It sort of reminds me of, I came up through the product management ranks, and we talk a lot about, being responsible for everything but in charge of nobody. And that's sort of the job. And that's almost a perfect partner for researchers, right? You have this skill set and capability to partner with these product leaders to really help drive that kind of change. And I think that maybe, to sort of summarize, highlights that this is not a replaceable skill set. It should be a shifting mindset of what that skill set can be applied to. And I think that's an exciting future.
Yeah, I totally agree. So you were saying earlier, Andy, we were like, hey, most products are bad, right? Why are products so bad? And when you were saying that, I was thinking, I think it's because like the enemy of good products is confirmation bias, right? Like, how do you end up with so many researchers and yet such bad products? It's because for a lot of executives, like they just can't hear another voice. They can't see another perspective, right? And so you're listening to customers. You were just talking about that. But like your average CEO listens to a lot of customers. How do you so I'm now I'm asking you, Andy, which is just like, how do you avoid that dangerous thing where it's like, yeah, I'm listening to customers, but mostly I'm just listening to find the things that I want to be true. How do you avoid that? And how do you get your researcher to help you?
Because I think most people don't listen to their actual customers. They listen to the people in their circle who happen to be customers. So when you talk to a CEO, they say, oh, I talk to people that use our bank all the time. It's like, yeah, you're talking to your high net worth friends at your family barbecue. These are not your average customers, right? Or, in the B2B space, I've worked at lots of these, big successful software companies, and the executives talk about all the time how they're out talking to their customers, but they're not. They're talking to the CEO or the CMO or the head of sales at their customer. They're not talking to the people that use these products, right? And so I think there's a real challenge of, yes, I'm listening to a few people, but I'm listening to the voices closest to me, and I'm listening to people that are like me, and I'm listening to people, and most people aren't senior executives. Like, so the math on that is just bad. Like, the math is that most senior executives are talking to some customers, and almost all of them are talking to people that aren't their actual customers. And I think that's hard. I mean, it's really hard. And I get it. When you're standing next to one of your friends at your kid's soccer game or something, and you find out that they use your app and they tell you what's not great about it. We've all been on the other end of those calls, right? The CEO comes into the office the next day. I heard from our customers that this is terrible. Like, right. That's not good research either. Yeah. Like, that's terrible. But this is what happens. And so very few companies, I think, have done an excellent job. We're getting there, of setting up real systematic signal gathering, a real way to sort of synthesize and understand those. And to your point, listen to disruptive voices, right? What is the intuition of what people really want, not just the next iterative change of our product? And I think those are hard problems.
Yeah, we're actively, you have to be willing to work. We're seeking out diverse voices. We want to falsify our beliefs, not just confirm them. And it is hard. One thing that's always been true of me is I'm almost always the one on the design team with an Android phone. I've always had an Android phone. Because, like in tech in general, but in design and research teams in general, like dominated by iOS. And like, that's a classist thing, because the world is mostly Android, and most people who don't have a lot of money are mostly using Android, right? And that's an oversimplification, but you get my point. Like, if all we ever experience is the iOS view, and there is a whole wide world of people out there. So it's just an example where I'm like, I think you make a great point. You have to be willing to work hard, and you have to, having a researcher next to you who can say, like, listen, like, let's falsify, not validate. Let's do what you want to do. I'll set up those listening sessions for you. No problem. But I'm going to do it I'm going to fill them with people you don't necessarily want to hear from or that you wouldn't normally hear from so that we can get you a broader point of view. That's like, if you can do that well, and I've seen that done well, it's a path to bursting bubbles in a really productive way, which makes better products.
Yeah, but to your point, it's a very deliberate act. This does not incidentally happen. And I think this is the kind of thing where, researchers, designers, product leaders, marketers, they could be making a decision to deliberately go do this. But that's a shift. To your point, that's not just, hey, can you validate that my design is okay with 10 people who already love our product? Like, yeah, sure, I can go do that. But like, is that really helpful?
I don't need to.
Right.
Yeah, I don't need to do that. Mission accomplished.
Right.
Yeah.
And even if they say it's kind of so-so, they already love our product, so ship it anyways. Like, there's a lot of that goes on, right? I mean, every researcher has been in those meetings where like, okay, it was sort of medium good, so we're going to ship it, right? But to your point, like, what's the disruptive thinking? What's the, very different perspective? What's the diverse audience we're going to get feedback on? That's a huge untapped opportunity. So I think, to maybe the point on your bright future for UX research article, I think that's the opportunity in front of us. And I think we see people shifting towards it.
I do too. I feel real optimistic, more than ever. Like, yes, the sort of inevitable recovery has taken longer than I thought. It is coming. Things are never as bad or as good as they seem. And I think like the future of our discipline is so bright, especially if we and when we sort of enable ourselves with more knowledge around how to dovetail with the business really effectively, how to partner, how to this focus on relationships in all these ways that we've been talking about. Like, these are the practical skills we need to be building. And I think there are more models than ever, successful models of teams and individuals who are breaking out of that mold. I just think it's like, we are not going to go back to the way it was before this moment in time. I think that era is over. And that's like all the R word ever meant to me, is that maybe this is a moment where things are evolving, and we, being a learning discipline, can do ourselves a service by paying attention and changing our practice. And I see it happening, which gives me a lot of optimism.
I love it. And I think maybe that's a great ending point. And I think we're seeing it in lots of roles, right? We know the UX research roles, but there are people all over ops and marketing and other places that said, hey, a couple of years ago when money was free and cheap, we just hired lots of people and saw what happened. And now we're thinking about how to scale differently and more effectively. And we're no different, but I think we have a unique perspective and something that's really important to the business when we do it right. So, Judd, this was a really interesting conversation. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are going to want to continue to stay engaged with your content. Where's the best place to follow you, to read what you're writing? How can people stay connected?
Thanks for asking. The best place to stay connected to my content is at onebigthought.com, which is my Medium site. I post articles on a regular basis. And then if you want to know more about me and what's going on with me, juddantin.com is the place to do that. It's kind of my home for my coaching and consulting. I'm on LinkedIn all the time, so that's the place to see me. And I'm happy to talk to everybody. I talk to community members all the time. I talk to teams. I love doing it. It's a lot of fun. I learn a lot. Can't beat it.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed not only reading your Medium articles, but there's great engagement in the comments. And I love that you're right in there talking with everybody. So there is a real dialogue going on. So if you're interested in joining the conversation, make sure to check out Judd's Medium posts. I really appreciate you taking some time to come talk about this. I was really excited when Nathan, our content producer here, was able to reach out and you offered to join the podcast. I was really looking forward to this. So thank you for making the time. And I think this was a great episode.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right, take care.